Hello, wider listeners. It is once again that time of the week where I come onto your radio dial and I tell y'all what is really going on right here in Kalamazoo, here in the state of Michigan, the so-called United States of America, and all over the world. From the depth perspective of a bunch of working class folks who've perhaps read one too many books, analyzing the corporate mainstream media and cutting through the BS. This is Media Cyphers, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. As always, the following thoughts, views, and opinions are not necessarily those of 89.1 WIDR or Western Michigan University, no matter how dope or insightful they may turn out to be. Anyway, we got a lot to talk about on the show here today. We're going to be opening up, as we often and always do, with some important local stuff. We've also got some stories coming up. An extremely draconian decision coming down from the Supreme Court. They've really been batting 1,000 lately when it comes to creating a lot of the authoritarian legal precedent for our decline into fascism. But more on that later. We'll be looking a little bit deeper at how a Michigan judge is characterizing some organizers out on the east side of the state. And also poking some holes in the drive, no pun intended, for lithium extraction when it comes to electric vehicles, and how, well, it may not be all it's cracked up to be, at least if we are still viewing it under the same sort of colonizer capitalist model that we have been doing thus far when it comes to fossil fuel extraction and, well, literally everything else. But before we get into all that, I actually wanted to open with a story from now Kalamazoo. And I think, there's a lot of doom and gloom on the program, and I think especially a lot of us lately, if we've been paying attention to the news, it's been very doomy and gloomy. It's that classic Rosa quote, we can either have socialism or barbarism, and a lot of what's been going on lately is, it's like, oh man, it's going to be barbarism, isn't it? But there's still a lot of great stuff, a lot of good work being done, all over the world, but also here at the community level. And I wanted to start the show by highlighting a piece of that, and especially talking about the unprecedented, or at least very, very high, probably has not been this high since the 90s, gun violence rates we've seen in the last couple years here in Kalamazoo. And I wanted to highlight some really good on-the-ground work that is being done to address that problem. Somebody who's grew up in the Edison neighborhood in the 90s, this is something that really does strike near and dear to my heart. Growing up is, especially if you grow up in a neighborhood that has a high incidence of gun violence, you become very desensitized to it. There's kind of a joke, like if a gunshot sounds like it came from more than 2 blocks away, you can stay on the porch and keep hanging out. We saw kind of a lull after the 90s, less gun violence overall. But since 2020, in particular, while this has also been happening all over the country, we have definitely seen this in Kalamazoo. We actually cracked the top 20 cities for gun violence in a recent article that came across my feed. It is a very sad thing, but again, wanted to highlight some really important work being done on the ground here to try to address that. So this is an article from Now Kalamazoo. It's one of my favorite outlets. They do some really important independent journalism right here in the Kalamazoo area. This is an article written by Ben Lando, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it for y'all. All right. Headline is Finding Peace During War. decade ago, two enemies in Kalamazoo put down their guns. Following 2 straight years of record gun violence in the city, their intervention program remains especially vigilant in helping others decide to disarm or not pick up a gun in the first place. And a couple things I want to highlight before I start this article. It really hits on a couple of important things. One, talking about the circumstances that drive a lot of people towards gun violence, talking about the link between gun violence and poverty, and also the history of, racist redlining, etc., etc. So yeah, this article does a really good job at stitching all of these things together. Although, I think before we get into the article, we're gonna take a quick little break. And when we come back, I will be reading from that piece. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, your only source for political revolution. Sorry, just wanted to do that quick message from the station before we got into the article here. So, gonna go ahead and read from this. On a day in late March that still felt like winter, an 11-year-old boy was sitting at the head of a conference table staring at a wall of graffiti depicting a kid firing a gun. The boy had run into some trouble. He wore a hoodie and a face mask, leaving only his eyes exposed as Yafinicio Big B Harris spoke to him. "I'm so happy you showed up," Harris said. "That's big, man." The boy was quiet, barely audible in his answers to Harris's questions about what brought him there and about what comes next. The conference room they're in was dubbed the War Room, in the basement of an office building in the Edison neighborhood. And it's the heart of Peace During War, an anti-gun violence street outreach and support group. Since 2011, co-founders Michael Wilder, 49, and Harris, 46, have fought to persuade people, one at a time, in prison or at their organization's headquarters, at family-style picnics and parties, to groups of school children, of the possibility of life without a gun and without the likelihood of an early death or jail sentence. Peace During War helps people embrace their past and find hope in their futures, leveraging other organizations and resources to prevent further gun violence. A proven but slow salve in an increasingly uphill battle. The young boy who Harris was trying to connect with had been temporarily removed from school for bringing in a bottle of liquor. Afterwards, a robbery landed him 4 felonies. Harris first met the boy a few days earlier when the Group Violence Intervention Program, an ally of Peace During War, called him to a juvenile home meeting to divert him from his path, using authenticity and empathy. There, Harris invited him to meet again, which is how he found himself sitting with a small group of Peace During War and GVI members less than a week after his release. Harris turned to the boy's mom, sitting on a couch in the corner. "I want him to know he has people he can talk to. He's got somebody he can call on." "Yes, sir," a colleague shouted in affirmation from the end of the table. Harris asked him why he brought liquor to school, who it was for. The boy didn't say much until his mom asked him directly why he wasn't answering the man, someone who was offering help. "You're the one who asked me to bring you to see him here," she said. They heard volumes in the young man's silence, which left them wondering whether shame or fear held him back from sharing. Without saying a word, everyone left the room except Harris, a colleague, the boy, and his mother, a smaller group where the boy would feel safer. They found out that the brother's boyfriend was abusive, but that without the power to stop it or tools to process it, the boy turned to a makeshift support network of older kids. That interaction demonstrated Peace During War's approach, peers trying to get others from their communities to turn away from gun culture. "Both of us have extensive felony records. We've been to prison multiple times. We are career criminals according to the state of Michigan," Wilder said in an interview sitting on the stoop of his house, where he was recovering from a quadruple bypass heart surgery. "We're using our negative past to help these young people's future." In a city the size of Kalamazoo, with 76,000 residents, gun violence has hit record highs, with numbers still small enough to feel personal. 13 people were shot to death in 2020 and 2021, respectively, up from 4 in 2018 and 7 in 2019. Assaults with a firearm doubled from 211 in 2018 to 401 in 2021. There are already more than 92 through April this year. Public officials are ringing the alarm to quickly fix a problem decades in the making. Kalamazoo City and county governments have each pledged $1 million towards ending gun violence and are currently putting spending plans together. Last month, the city allocated an additional $1 million of pandemic stimulus funds to youth programs aimed at keeping kids too busy and engaged to pick up a gun, including an estimated $500,000 on the sports league. Public safety officials know they can't solve the problem alone. In a written statement on the crucial value of partnerships, Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety Chief Vernon Coakley said that community members with moral authority over group members deliver a credible moral message against violence. Yeah, sorry, I'm tripping over my words today. And I couldn't agree more. I think, again, this program is a terrific example of alternatives to over-policing. It's something we critique on the show quite often. The approach is neither new nor hypothetical for Harris and Wilder, but it costs time and money. They've taken on relevant jobs with other organizations to pay the bills associated with peace during war. Small expenses like taking kids out for meals or entertainment or new clothes and dropping them off with a bag full of groceries to a home with a bare refrigerator can add up. They also invest their time in being ready to answer a call and show up to keep someone from picking up a gun. They could do more, both Harris and Wilder say, if they had other tangible support like money from community leaders. In many ways, peace during war is the reason Harris and Wilder, who first came to know each other as mortal enemies, are still alive. Wilder was a street runner and drug dealer pledged against Harris in a cycle of retaliation for a murder. Wilder is blamed for one of his friends killing Harris's cousin. "I'm not going to stop until Michael is dead," Harris says he told himself at the time. After a stint in Jackson State Prison, Harris ran into Wilder at Kalamazoo Valley Community College, where they were both students. It was more than a year since they had seen each other. Separately, they'd each made a choice during their last incarceration to give themselves a chance. But on campus, Wilder didn't recognize Harris, and Harris wasn't sure if Wilder's inspirational talk in class or his new gospel-focused life was an act. Misjudging an enemy can be a fatal mistake, so Harris kept up a front for a month until he realized Wilder was sincere. The past was in the past, Harris said. What happened had to be set aside to move forward. Harris, originally from Arkansas, eventually persuaded Chicago native Wilder to join him at a bar and pool hall, where they started dreaming up peace during war. The popular bar was later shut down during a deadly shooting shortly after. The professor of their class put them in touch with a nationally syndicated radio show on NPR to tell their story. After many attempts to bring their story to teens, a local alternative high school invited them to an event. Peace During War was by far the most popular presentation, commanding the attention of the most difficult-to-reach kids at the school and sparking Harris and Wilder's public speaking careers. Then, in 2014, a local foundation and a professor at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo helped them make a mini-documentary. The two men have since developed their own support network. To pay their own bills, they continue to work for other local organizations doing similar work. Harris works for Urban Alliance, a community organization in the Edison neighborhood that houses Peace During War, as a connections coordinator, leveraging his experience to ensure impact in a city where funding priorities are often top-down decisions. Harris and Wilder direct people to services like the Urban Alliance's group counseling and job training programs. With its help, they are working towards designating Peace During War a formal 501c3 nonprofit so they can apply for grant funding and eventually earn a direct paycheck for their work. Wilder is employed as a local coordinator of GVI, the national framework for supplanting a traditional police-first approach to gun violence with one that recognizes the social context of a shooting. This can make for an awkward alliance between police and the street at times, though it allows Wilder, Harris, and their colleagues to access to and an exit ramp for young people who are just entering the criminal justice system. The shape of a single day for Peace During War is determined by who comes or calls in for help. There's a constant flow in and out of the war room and the newly painted offices in the basement of the Urban Alliance building, like a beehive where everyone has their own purpose within the common mission. People there are seeking help, or they volunteer or work for any of the other half-dozen organizations with some sort of presence in Urban Alliance. 20 minutes after the private meeting between the 11-year-old and Harris strode into the meeting room where everyone else had relocated, his phone on speaker. A friend who was locked up in federal prison was on the line and told Harris that he had been up all night consoling his cellmate, whose brother had been in a deadly car accident in Kalamazoo's north side neighborhood that morning. The man declined Big B's offer to put some funds in his commissary, but thanked him for being there. "I'm never too busy for you, man," Harris told his friend. He hung up and turned to a woman facing nearly a dozen federal charges and who needed better legal help. She said she felt trapped. She can walk away if she snitches, the prosecutor told her. In her mind, that means she's not a threat to society. So why, she wondered out loud, would she face a life sentence if she declined? "I can't," she starts to say, dark thoughts creeping in, trailing off just as those around her jumped in with support. "Don't even go there," Harris says. "Remember what we talked about on your porch the other day?" While a colleague processed receipts for reimbursement, Harris checked on the son of a neighborhood barber who's taking his GED practice exam in a nearby room. Harris then stepped outside for a smoke break, holding the door open for a woman whom he introduced as having spent 15 years in prison and who now helped other young women avoid that route. He pulled on his convenience store cigar and exhaled as he mulled over his experience alone in the room with the 11-year-old boy and his mom, and the conditions that led them there, the smoke disappearing in a wet spring snowfall. And this next section deep dives a little bit into the kind of socio-economic reasons behind why a lot of this work is necessary. And I think it's really a very important part of this article to highlight. Wealth inequality is particularly concentrated in Kalamazoo's North Side, East Side, and Edison neighborhoods, a stratification linked to racist housing and banking policies. According to the County Mental Health Services provider Integrated Services of Kalamazoo, ISK, those disparities have lasting impacts on residents' health, well-being, and sense of overall safety. So it's not a coincidence that the vast majority of gun violence takes place in the city's poorer neighborhoods, says Esteban Esto Juarez, a former gang member who is now a pastor and an ally of peace during war. And of course, last November, many of you remember, he was elected to the Kalamazoo City Commission. There's a causal and harmfully logical relationship between a lack of economic opportunities, generational poverty, and the choice of some to pick up a gun, he says. No one wakes up one day and says, "I'm going to pick up a gun and I'm going to be violent," Juarez says. It's a combination of different things that the individual had to go through to see for himself or herself that, well, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter because everything else has failed me. Recent national studies agree. In an August 2021 study published in The Lancet, researchers from Boston University and the University of Alabama at Birmingham traced the through lines, likely starting at redlining and segregation, which end with increased incidents of gun violence in poorer neighborhoods. Racist housing policies have had direct consequences on the socioeconomic and demographic makeup of urban neighborhoods. These in turn have led to the disproportionate firearm victimization of, particularly, young black men in these communities, the study concluded. Researchers from medical schools at Harvard and Northwestern University, the Albert Einstein School of Medicine, and children's hospitals in New York, Chicago, and Boston found that people 24 and younger were at higher risk of exposure to gun violence if they were living in poor communities. The study was published last November in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Meanwhile, low-wage jobs, a lack of affordable housing, and inadequate economic development create a dangerous atmosphere where stress is compounded and leads to violence. Peace During War tries to address all of these issues. Instead of running armed crews, positioning young men as lookouts for police intent on busting the drug stash, they now get calls from police to mediate a street dispute. I do get pushback from my community because they may see me with a police officer. Nobody likes to call the police, Harris said. My police buddy might get pushback from their police buddy saying, "Hey, why are you hanging out with those criminals? They're going to bite you in the ASS." And just a real quick aside there, that is definitely a step in the right direction. It's kind of like, we talk about on the show, mentioned this many times, like, why don't they call, some sort of like social worker or counselor or somebody else like that on the scene instead of, a cop having to do it in a very police-like way, which can lead a lot to the cop violence that we see in America. So this is an example of getting a hold of that alternative to the police. So there are some good stuff in our community going on in that sense. Just to point that out. Still, Harris says it often feels like they aren't getting the support they need from the criminal justice system and community leaders who wield power. They don't see enough action when they talk about reducing the negative pressure of the criminal justice system's inflexibility and historic discrimination. What are we gaining from stirring up all that hope, and then to get it crushed? Harris said. Then what? You know what we risk for that? Instead of inventing new programs from the outside, Juarez says, city funds and efforts should provide opportunities and spaces for community-wide discussions to find solutions that will have impact. In the nonprofit space, funding and sustainability often depend on measurable wins. There's no way to calculate how many kids ultimately decide not to pick up a gun because of peace during war. No quote-unquote key performance indicators to track how many kids decide to play basketball with other kids at the Urban Alliance instead of doing something else, instead of, say, committing acts of violence. But Wilder and Harris feel a sense of success when a kid opens up to them about food insecurity and lets the duo spend $100 on groceries. And when students and parents come back to them years later to share how the group improved their lives. Or when community members lined up to check in on Wilder as he recovered on his couch from heart surgery, as his visiting mother, who still lives in Chicago, witnessed just how different her ex-drug dealer's son's life had become. And then there are the bigger markers. One of the most basic but impactful indicators of the success of peace during war and the community's anti-gun violence initiatives is that, after 2 years of record gun deaths, no one has been killed so far in 2022, Wilder said during the interview on his front porch in late April. Unfortunately, the next morning, police announced a 35-year-old had been found shot dead. There is a war brewing as we speak, Wilder said in a text message. My team is getting ready to go talk to known shooters tomorrow to calm things down. So again, that was a really, really important and really well-written piece from Ben Lando, highlighting the work of Peace During War, which operates out of the Edison neighborhood and with Urban Alliance. Really great stuff. So, and again, that was written by Ben Lando and Chris Killian. All right, we're going to take a quick little break. We come back. Again, we got a lot more to talk about. I think I'm going to talk about the story from Detroit, kind of a quick hit about some comrades who had to deal with some pretty wonky out there discrimination from a Democratic Party judge, no less. Anyway, we will be right back. This is Media Cyphers, only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, your only source for political revolution. And we are back. This is Media Cyphers, only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, your only source for political revolution. So this next article we want to talk about, this comes from Left Voice, and this is some pretty wonky out there, like, racism from the Michigan justice system. So this is actually kind of a follow-up to some stories we were talking about about 2 years ago during the summer of rebellion, the uprisings and such. And some of you may or may not remember, there was a particularly racist police chief in Shelby Township. Was basically talking about, declaring open season on Black Lives Matter and leftist protesters. And so people went out to protest that and were met with police brutality. And this is a follow-up to that story, and it's just ridiculous is probably the only word for it. So this article was published on May 23rd. It's a pretty short article. I've got a little bit of commentary on it, but Michigan judge equates BLM protester to die-hard terrorist. Michigan judge refused to dismiss felony charges against BLM organizer and Left Voice member Tristan Taylor for his participation in a 2020 protest against police violence, instead comparing him to the terrorists from the movie Die Hard. I'm not making that up. All right, so going on. Today yesterday, at the 16th Circuit Court in Macomb County, Judge Servito denied a motion to quash felony charges against Tristan Taylor, one of the Shelby Five arrested for walking in the street during a nonviolent racial justice protest in 2020. During the hearing, Taylor's lawyer, George Washington, argued in a motion that Taylor had only been given 1 to 3 seconds to comply with officers before being arrested, which was not a reasonable amount of time. Servita admitted he hadn't reviewed the video evidence in the motion and instead went on a tangent about the movie Die Hard, comparing the protest to the climax of the movie and comparing Taylor to the movie's villains, a group of terror. Well, okay. Man, this is one of the stories I wish Lawrence was here because we could make a field day of this. The villains to Die Hard weren't even terrorists. They were basically jewel thieves. It was a pretense. So I don't know how protesting a racist sheriff is somehow a scheme to get like valuable artwork and stuff. But I guess I'll just read the rest of the article. Like, I don't know. There's like certain things you hear that are so both depressingly dystopian, but also just so absolutely silly that like your brain kind of short circuits. It's like, this is terrible. Especially like I'm loosely acquainted with like some of the people involved in this. Like, one, they're certainly not Hans Gruber. They do some really wonderful work in their community, but like, ridiculous, but also really horrifying and distressing and outrage. We should really need to be upset that people like this are allowed to be judges for not only dismissing somebody who basically was brutalized for exercising their supposed First Amendment right, but then comparing them to terrorists in a Hollywood movie or thieves. But I don't know. It's a little the metaphor that the judge is using is pretty confused. Maybe the judge is pretty confused to begin with. Anyway, for context, as I mentioned earlier, the 2020 protest was organized to condemn Shelby Township Police Chief Robert Chalette, who made statements calling racial justice protesters wild savages and saying about them body bags for these vicious subhumans. Again, that's a police chief saying that. So, you know, when we say on the show often, you know, some of those that work forces are the same that burn crosses. You know, we're not just trying to be like, you know, shock jocks or something. Anyway, it goes on to say, Shelby Township Police responded to the protest with extreme force, charging 5 people with felonies and over a dozen with misdemeanors. And this is also a national trend. We're seeing more and more often nonviolent protesters getting hit with very like extreme like felonies and misdemeanor charges, where before they, you know, kind of like more of a catch and release situation. After the hearing, Washington said, the current racist fascist climate has infected even a Democratic Party judge. The only thing you as a citizen can say is, how high do you want me to jump, officer? Whatever mantra they have about how democratic this nation is, in truth, when it comes to a black man being arrested for protesting racism, a judge in the United States of America compared the incident of someone trying to de-escalate a situation to a terrorist scenario from a movie in the 80s, Taylor said. Washington concluded, this is a new low in dealing with protests. I really have dealt with hundreds, thousands of protests in my life, and I've never seen anything like this. What they want to do is impose convictions so that nobody will come back to Shelby Township. They have their clean white city sitting out there on a hill that doesn't have to deal with Detroit. We've got our little Jim Crow era Mississippi in the north part of the Detroit metro area. And that article also links to a live stream of Washington Taylor's statements on the events of that day in court. So again, and it's worth highlighting, they mentioned this is a Democratic Party judge. This isn't one of those crazy Trumpist Republican judges. This is somebody from the Democratic Party who is using like a very ridiculous analogy to demonize a peaceful Black Lives Matter protester and community organizer. So, again, it's ridiculous and really worth highlighting. And, again, worth looking at talking about like the Shelby Township thing, because again, it's it's really like sending that message where it's like, you stay in Detroit, do not go to these primarily white areas where you quote unquote. Well, I'm just like, ostensibly the message is you don't belong up there. Yeah, even though like that was a very brave thing to go up to Shelby Township and protest the sheriff who was saying like overtly like racist, fascist stuff. And then again, I guess it wasn't too much of a surprise that they were brutalized by the police, but it is a depressing new low that not only are they still being stuck with felonies, but a judge from ostensibly the liberal party of the United States went so far as to compare them to Hollywood terrorists. So again, that's from Left Voice. Michigan judge equates BLM protester to diehard terrorist. We're going to take another very quick break, and when we come back, we've got some more story. We got another story about judges gone wild. I gotta really flex the humor in this episode because like a lot of these stories are just really like depressing, and we're talking about like the decline of whatever democracy, whatever fig leaf of democracy exists in the United States. We're really seeing a lot of brazen attacks on it lately, and this decision from the Supreme Court we're about to talk about just guts out any semblance of fairness or some semblance of fairness in a criminal justice system. And we'll be talking about it in just a minute here. But again, we're going to do another quick little break. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, your only source for political revolution. Hello, everybody. We are back. This is Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. So, transitioning from a story about a Michigan judge acting like an absolute fool and dishing out an unjust ruling to the Supreme Court doing something very, very similar, but with farther reaching ramifications that really are just stripping some key rights and fairness, or well, I guess enshrining unfairness into the general criminal justice system. Again, the American criminal justice system wasn't all that great to begin with, and the Supreme Court has just voted to make it considerably worse. This is an article from Common Dreams. Headline is, Perverse Supreme Court Ruling Effectively Ensures That Innocent People Will Remain Imprisoned. This is written by Jessica Corbett, and it came out May 23rd. Legal experts responded with alarm Monday to a ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court's right-wing majority that could lead to the indefinite imprisonment and even execution of people who argue their lawyers didn't provide adequate representation after convictions in state court. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, joined by the other two liberals on the court, also blasted the majority opinion in Shin versus Martinez Ramirez, writing in her scathing dissent, the decision is both perverse and illogical. The case involved two men, David Martinez Ramirez and Barry Lee Jones, who are on death row in Arizona. The majority determined that inmates can't present new evidence in federal court to support a claim that their post-conviction attorney in state court was ineffective, in violation of the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which affirms the right to an assistance of counsel in all criminal prosecutions. A federal habeas corpus may not conduct an evidentiary hearing or otherwise consider evidence beyond the state court record based on ineffective assistance of state post-conviction counsel. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote for the majority, adding that serial relitigation of final convictions undermines the finality that is essential to both the retributive and deterrent functions of criminal law. So I want to spend a moment really looking at what they're saying there. So they're arguing that it is somehow not the right thing to do for a person to say, I would like to take this to the federal level, or I would look to my case to be reopened because my attorney didn't do a good enough job. And this article is going to outline later too, especially this really boils down to a form of class warfare, because if you can't afford a good attorney, you're going to get a court-appointed one, and the court-appointed ones are typically, really, even the good ones are just overworked and stretched to capacity. It's very difficult to get that level of representation that you would if you were rich and you had really good attorneys. So this basically becomes a form of class warfare to say, if you can't afford a really great attorney in the first place, you're just going to spend the rest of your life in jail or, whatever, even if you can prove later on that it was an unjust conviction. Also, saying that serial relitigation of final convictions undermines the finality as essential both to the retributive and deterrent functions of criminal law. Yeah, that is definitely an illogical and perverse argument. He's basically saying there if innocent people go to prison for a crime they didn't commit, we cannot give them a way out because that might make all of the actual criminals think that they'll be able to get away with it. It's absolutely absurd. The rationale behind this, well, I guess I'll read on more before I go on my own rants, but going on to say, so Sotomayor, meanwhile, wrote that the Sixth Amendment guarantees criminal defendants the right to an effective assistance of counsel at trial. This court has recognized that right as a bedrock principle that constitutes the very foundation for our adversary system of criminal justice. Today, however, the court hamstrings the federal court's authority to safeguard that right. The court's decision will leave many people who were convicted in violation of the Sixth Amendment to face incarceration or even execution without any meaningful chance to vindicate their right to counsel, she warned. Also noting that the ruling all but overrules two recent precedents, Martinez versus Ryan and Trevino versus Thaler. In a piece for Slate highlighting how the ruling will cause profound suffering and perhaps even death as people are denied their constitutional rights, University of Michigan Law School professor Leah Littman declared that the majority took a wrecking ball to those decisions. As Littman detailed Monday, indigent defense for people who lack the resources to hire their own lawyer, is in crisis in this country. Indigent defense is woefully underfunded, and public defenders handle hundreds of cases per year, many more than they have the time or resources to manage effectively. States also heavily restrict the procedures and resources that would allow public defenders to develop their cases in greater depth. But just as there is an indigent defense crisis in the country, there's also a post-conviction crisis. Post-conviction proceedings are woefully underfunded, and lawyers are limited in the time and resources they have to pursue post-conviction relief. So defendants who are represented by ineffective lawyers at trial may then be represented by an ineffective lawyer during their post-conviction proceedings, when they are supposed to be arguing that their trial lawyer was ineffective. And, surprise, the ineffective post-conviction lawyer may fail to argue that the trial lawyer was ineffective, or may fail to develop any evidence in support of that claim. In a series of tweets, fellow Michigan law professor Andrew Fleischman pointed out that without ineffective assistance of counsel claims, there is no procedural vehicle to bring evidence of actual innocence in most states. So if you have a crappy conflict trial lawyer and a crappy conflict appeals lawyer and a mountain of evidence that you are innocent, no relief, Fleischman said, noting Jones's argument that there is evidence of his innocence. They go on to say in the tweets, and I really do want to highlight this. Andrew Fleischman says via Twitter, so for instance, let's say there is video footage of you 1,000 miles away from the scene of the crime while it's occurring. You beg your lawyers to find it. They never do. You get to federal habeas. You can't get that evidence in. Or let's look at Jones, who was accused of killing his girlfriend's daughter on a day that she was in his sole care. He presented evidence that that injury could not have been inflicted on that day because of this ruling from the Supreme Court. inadmissible. Other legal experts were similarly critical on social media. University of Texas professor of law Lee Kvartsky called the opinion an abomination, while public defender Eliza Orland said, "This is radical, this is horrifying, this is extremely scary." Slate senior writer Mark Joseph Stern tweeted that the absolutely atrocious opinion effectively ensures that innocent people will remain imprisoned. The unceasing stream of callous, radical, reactionary decisions coming from the Supreme Court is fairly easy to miss because so many of them involve complicated points of law, Stern added. But the conservative majority is very much in the midst of a revolution, and it is a brutal one. Although, I would just say, little Marxist Picadillo, more of a counter-revolution than a revolution, but, so I think that, the lawyers really laid it out for us, just how awful and terrifying the Supreme Court decision is. It's really not getting as much press attention as, the Roe v. Wade leak, or a number of other stories coming down, but the implications of this are rather horrifying. It really it leaves particularly, like I mentioned, poor people. If you are wrongly convicted of a crime, you basically have no way out if the first round of cases goes bad. And if you are stuck with a lawyer who is too overworked to do an effective defense, well, too bad. Them's the breaks. And even if you can concretely prove your innocence, believe it or not, straight to jail. Ah, yes, as Childish Gambino once said, this is America. And I guess, the only real surprising thing to me about this is, even in the midst of the reign of the orange one, there were actually some positive moves being made towards criminal justice reform. Even people as reactionary as Jared Kushner were pushing for prison reform, and even a lot of Republicans were as well. And this decision from the Supreme Court sees us not only propelling ourselves backwards when it comes to criminal justice reform, but really enshrining this draconian police state. We talk a lot about how the documentary 13th points this out too, is that a big function of the U.S.'s overblown prison population is as a source of free labor. It says in the 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished unless you are in prison. You think I am? And read the 13th Amendment. That's some Killer Mike. But, it definitely, what purpose does this serve? Clarence Thomas, his argument for the majority, it doesn't even go down to the rights of individuals. It's just we don't think law will be enough of a deterrent if there's a possibility people can get their convictions overturned. And again, poor people are not going to be able to afford good enough lawyers to even do that in the first place. So it really serves no function except to make sure that innocent prisoners do not have a way out. And if their first trial went bad, too bad. That's just the way it is. I cannot stress enough how, the Supreme Court's really been on one lately. And, if we had an opposition party, they're not even an opposition party. The Democratic Party is in power right now, and this is happening while they are in power. It just goes to the ineffectual nature of the Democratic Party. The kind of lip service against injustice when, as we've mentioned on the show, they could codify abortion rights right now. They could expand the Supreme Court right now. They could, put term limits on judges right now. They refuse to do any and all of these things because the fig leaf of the filibuster, and we don't want to upset Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema, and they've got these well-earned principles about maintaining the filibuster. Even though, again, those aren't really principles. Those are the fact that Joe Manchin is a coal billionaire and Kristen Sinema sold her soul to the lobbyists many years ago. You know, if they'd actually maybe pushed for like some sort of campaign finance reform, we might not have politicians like Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema, blockading progress in the way that they are. And of course, the saddest thing about all of this is, again, this isn't an accident. People like Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin serve a very particular role. And I know I'm getting kind of far afield of this, but it really does boil down to the fact that the Democratic Party, as a bloc right now, could fix this. They are refusing not to. And they have always had people like Kristen Sinema or Joe Manchin as kind of like, it's like the heel in wrestling. They play the bad guy so that the Democratic Party doesn't have to actually do anything. And whether it's them or Joe Lieberman 20 years ago or whoever else in the past, the Democratic Party really has not been making any substantial moves, or at least ceding any ground to working class since at least the 1970s. And that is a product of the fact that, and I know I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but this is all related. The fact that the labor movement was beaten down and crippled throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. The fact that they basically, especially 70s and 80s. The fact that there was no longer a strong enough labor union to influence a political party or, put their feet to the fire. The fact that the Democratic Party itself has done nothing but skew further and further to the right for the last 30 years. Only very, very recently trying to look at some of the progressive ideas that were foisted upon them by public pressure back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. So we're left with the situation where we more or less have to just kind of watch helplessly while this party that will pay lip service to racial justice, will pay lip service to all of these things that, most Americans want. And they will sit on their hands and point at Kristen Sinema or Joe Manchin, who they don't even have the temerity to, if somebody were to challenge them, like a primary challenge, I am dead certain the GCCC and the rest of the Democratic Party would probably support Manchin and Sinema, because, again, we need ideological diversity in the party, which is, really code for Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. They are the Democratic Party. They are who people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer want to be in charge. Because, again, they represent their presumed constituency, which is not you or me. It's the same constituency as the Republican, which is they represent the ruling class. That is what they are there to do. Democrats represent a more kind of liberal-leaning ruling class. Republicans, a more conservative-leaning ruling class. But at the end of the day, whether you are a Republican judge who supports this motion, or a Republican rank-and-file voter who maybe would find this terrifying, it doesn't matter. Because for all the corporations who are probably going to be out and about with all their Pride Month stuff next month, they all draw from the same pool of prison slave labor. So this is good for everybody who controls the means of production, which is to say the ruling class. And it's terrible for everybody else. All right. So, again, with that, if you want to check out that article, that's on Common Dreams. Headline is, Perverse Supreme Court Ruling Effectively Ensures That Innocent People Will Remain Imprisoned. I'm going to take a quick little musical break. I hope you're enjoying it. This is the music of Quantum Fleek, Kalamazoo's own Quantum Fleek. Big shout out to them for letting me use their music as background music for the show. Anyway, I'm going to take a very quick little break, and then we'll come back. I've got some more to talk about. Got some international pieces that I want to talk about next. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, your only source for political revolution. Welcome back. This is Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, only on WIDR Kalamazoo. So next story I want to talk about, we're going to take it into foreign policy, internationalism, imperialism story. And it's just something I saw on the morning news, and I decided to deep dive a little bit more into it. Biden is in Asia right now, and he said some kind of like saber-rattling comments about China and Taiwan that I found particularly alarming. There's an article here I'm going to read from the World Socialist website that I think really draws out some of the alarming implications that came to mind for me personally when this popped up on my watching CBS Morning News. This is written by Peter Simmons. It's published on May 22nd. Biden's trip to Asia prepares for military confrontation with China. Even as his administration is ramping up its proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, President Biden is on his first visit to Asia, colluding with major allies and strategic partners to step up the U.S.-led confrontation with China, to economically weaken it and prepare for war. Biden's trip to South Korea and Japan, U.S. imperialism's chief military allies in East Asia, will culminate in a meeting tomorrow at the leaders of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, a strategic grouping directed against China that includes the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. Immediately prior to departing for South Korea, Biden met with Finnish and Swedish leaders at the White House to discuss their bids to join NATO to strengthen the alliance against Russia. And we had an article we didn't manage to get to last week, but that's also really scary in its implications, and very cynical too. The leaders of Sweden, Sweden and Finland have been historically neutral. Finland for very dubious reasons, because they sided with the Germans in World War II. Who had, as you all might remember, some very odious policies. Finland and Sweden have been neutral for decades and decades. Sweden in particular is it's almost part of their national heritage that they don't get involved in war. And their leaders very cynically took a spur moment where the polling, not even a majority of Swedish or Finnish people, but like slightly more than usual, supported joining NATO. And they seized the moment. It's like, oh, we're part of NATO now, against the wishes of most of their own population. But anyway, in Seoul on Saturday, Biden signed off on the $40 billion military aid package for Ukraine with the aim of enmeshing and weakening Russia through a protracted war. From the outset of the Ukraine war, the Biden administration has made not the slightest pretense of enlisting Beijing as a mediator in negotiations to end the conflict. Rather, Washington has denounced China for refusing to condemn the Russian invasion, threatened economic sanctions, and accused Beijing, without a shred of evidence, of preparing to invade Taiwan. The New York Times claimed that the purpose of Biden's trip was to demonstrate that the United States remained focused on countering China, even as his administration stage-managed a war against Russia in Europe. There is nothing defensive, however, about the escalating U.S. military buildup and associated demonization of Beijing. Biden's talks with newly elected South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol underscored the purpose of the trip as a whole: to restart major joint military exercises, boost South Korea's military capabilities, and consolidate key supply chains, such as semiconductors, to restrict any economic reliance on China in the event of conflict. Both South Korea and Japan are long-standing U.S. military allies and house vital American bases that are integral to the Pentagon war planning. While the supposed North Korean threat is the pretext, the consolidation and boosting of these alliances is directed against China. The two countries house U.S. anti-ballistic missile systems that are a key element in U.S. strategic preparations for a nuclear war. Significantly, discussions are underway in both countries about the stationing of U.S. medium-range nuclear missiles on their territories. Employing the language of war, a senior U.S. defense official told the Defense One website last week that Biden's trip was proof positive that the U.S. could maintain both fronts in Europe and Asia. Everybody's focused on Ukraine, and we understand that, but that doesn't mean that we've stopped working with allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. It doesn't mean we stopped our air and naval activity in the Indo-Pacific either, the official said. The U.S. has continued its naval provocations in the South China Sea under the guise of freedom of navigation, and as recently as May 10th sent a warship through the narrow strait between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. The Biden administration's focus on Taiwan and discussions in Asia is particularly sinister. In the same way that it goaded Moscow into a war in Ukraine as a means of bogging down the Russian military in a protracted conflict, the U.S. is seeking to exploit Taiwan as a potential quagmire for the Chinese armed forces. Again, this isn't new. This reminds me a lot of how the U.S. wanted to bring the Soviet Union into a Vietnam-style quagmire in Afghanistan. And again, this is very much using normal average people as pawns, ignoring the innocent lives that would be impacted in Afghanistan and Soviet Union at the time. And again, they're just, the same playbook. Taking up where Trump left off, Biden has provocatively undermined the long-standing One China policy, under which the U.S. de facto recognizes the Chinese Communist Party regime in Beijing as the legitimate government of all of China, including Taiwan. When formal diplomatic relations were established with China in 1979, the U.S. cut diplomatic ties with Taipei, downgraded contracts, and removed all military forces from the island. Over the past year, Biden has dropped the previous barriers to top-level meetings, acknowledged that U.S. military trainers are stationed in Taiwan, and increased U.S. naval activities through the Taiwan Strait and neighboring waters. When China responded by increasing its air activity near Taiwan, Washington accused China of preparing to invade. Indeed, the U.S. is consciously arming Taiwan for a war of attrition against any Chinese invasion, insisting that it buys weapons for asymmetrical warfare against a much larger Chinese military. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, told a congressional hearing in April that Taiwan could draw an important lesson from Ukraine as a nation in arms. If your opponent tries to invade you and every military-aged man and woman is armed and they have a little bit of training, that can be a very effective use, Milley said. And, one should add, especially if they are armed to the teeth with billions of dollars of sophisticated American weaponry and supplemented by crippling economic and financial sanctions. Charles Adell, a senior analyst at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, told the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Thursday that the U.S. strategy in the Ukraine war provided a good quote-unquote template the administration can build on when thinking about how to protect Taiwan from a potential Chinese invasion. In reality, the U.S. is not considering how to defend Taiwan, but how to use the people of Taiwan as cannon fodder in a war with China. Biden's trip to Asia underscores the fact that U.S. imperialism is recklessly pursuing a strategy aimed at securing control of the strategic Eurasian landmass and its resources and preventing any challenge to its global hegemony by Russia or China, which the U.S. regards as its chief threats. In its historic decline, Washington is driven to resort to military means to shore up its dominance. For more than a decade, starting with President Obama's pivot to Asia, the U.S. has sought to undermine and encircle China diplomatically, economically, and militarily. Now engulfed in an unprecedented social and economic crisis at home and the reemergence of class struggles, the Biden administration has plunged Europe into war and is preparing the same in Asia, threatening the world with a clash of nuclear-armed powers. Acutely conscious of what is looming, General Mark Milley warned cadets graduating from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point on Saturday to be prepared for World War. The world you are being commissioned into has the potential for a significant international conflict between great powers, and that potential is increasing, not decreasing, he said. A U.S. war with China would be a disaster for the working class in Asia and internationally. And the only means for halting this headlong rush towards a catastrophic nuclear war is a unified struggle of workers in China, the U.S., and around the world on the basis of an internationalist and socialist perspective against the capitalist system that is the root of war. And again, that was from the World Socialist website, written by Peter Simmons. Biden's trip to Asia prepares for military confrontation with China. All right, we're going to take a quick little break. When we come back, I've got a story here about lithium extraction. Fun. Yeah. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, your only source for political revolution. Welcome back. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. Also, a quick reminder, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, and we have a podcast, Media Cyphers Kalamazoo. We put the best material from our show, and we put it online. Just a little plug, you should check out our latest episode. We interviewed Casey Groton about Radiant Church and a lot of the businesses they're taking up downtown, and the fact that the church they are a part of or affiliated with is explicitly homophobic. Again, it's a really important local piece and information about that, so, I'd really recommend check that out. One of my favorite pieces we've done this year. Not that I like the content of it, but it's important information for your everyday life, I guess. So we're going to do another story here, and I think last half hour, I think I'm just going to toss it off to maybe play some commentary from Mr. Richard Wolff and his show Economic Update. But I've got one more article here that I wanted to hit on before we do that. This comes from Truth Out. It's written by Adriana Daraqui. It was published on May 23rd. Headline is, Electric Cars and Lithium Extraction Threaten to Drive Even More Climate Harm. The climate emergency is almost universally seen by nations of the world as a threat to future survival. But approaches to mitigate it that are promoted by policymakers in the global north focus on so-called net zero emissions based on dubious carbon trading schemes to maintain current lifestyles and business as usual. But in the global south, popular environmentalism relates to the struggle to achieve fair ecological distribution, to defend community access to natural resources, and to protect people's livelihoods, all of which are threatened not only by climate change, but unequal burdens placed on the global south by so-called nature-based solutions. This has been seen quite dramatically in programs such as reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation that has led to the displacement of native cultures in order to convert or commodify ecosystems into assets that can to be traded as carbon offsets for carbon-emitting industries. Moreover, green policies that promote renewable energy technologies such as solar panels, wind turbines, and electric batteries threaten to do even more harm to ecosystems and extraction areas by destroying biodiversity, contaminating water, and causing social and environmental damage to local indigenous communities. As underscored in the latest United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures above pre-industrial levels is imminent, and temperature increases could even exceed this level. As the planet moves towards this daunting benchmark, renewable energy technology is being heralded as crucial in efforts to rapidly decarbonize global energy systems. Moreover, the concept of shifting to renewable energies with a full transition to wind, water, and solar energy by 2050 are presented by technology companies as both technically and economically feasible with few downsides. The transition to a low-carbon world, however, threatens to replicate the ecological destruction of the fossil fuel extraction system on the ecosystems of the extractive areas. As such, climate change mitigation based on renewable energy transition has become complicit in condoning ecological degradation and perpetuating violent conflicts, as well as unjust patterns of colonialism, racism, patriarchy, militarization, and structural violence. In this sense, climate mitigation consequences are not distributed equally, nor are they experienced by a uniform set of actors. In fact, they threaten to exacerbate the climate debt to the global south. The most recent UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, Scotland, COP26, delivered the Glasgow Climate Pact, in which 153 countries committed to securing near global net zero emissions. The proposal includes a mitigation plan to accelerate the switch to electric vehicles, in which more than 30 countries, 6 major vehicle manufacturers, and major cities set out their determination for all new car and van sales to reach zero emissions by 2040 globally, and in 2035 in leading markets. The electrification of cars for decarbonization and the Paris Agreement and Glasgow Climate Pact requirements are examples of the same colonialist, extractivist business as usual and involve many environmental consequences while failing to cut carbon emissions at their source. First, electric vehicles have a substantial carbon footprint because they require batteries made of lithium, a non-renewable resource stored in prehistoric water on indigenous land. The process for mining lithium requires taking a large amount of water from vulnerable ecosystems, which disrupts their fragile natural balance. Second, reducing emissions also depends on how electric vehicles are used post-production, because charging electric vehicles relies upon local electrical grids. Where electrical grids run on coal, electric vehicles may increase the carbon dioxide emissions, which adds another layer to energy demand. The electrification of cars, as proposed by European and American policies, also reproduces the current model of individual car use and does not relieve congestion in crowded cities. Lithium-ion batteries were launched in the 1990s and were gradually introduced in consumer electronics. The internal chemistry of lithium light, conducive and energy-dense, allows it to recharge electricity quickly and efficiently. Lithium-ion batteries turn out to be many times more energy efficient than the nickel-metal hybrid equivalent, and these appealing properties have positioned lithium as a commodity that is central to the future decarbonization of the energy, electronics, and automobile industries. Lithium demand for the manufacture of rechargeable batteries has doubled in less than 10 years, and it is projected to increase fivefold by 2025. These predictions were made before the COP26, a process that is directly related to carbon mitigation policies. Sustainable, contemporary, responsible, reflexive, and adapted to the 21st century, lithium is frequently framed as an environmentally benign resource that differs significantly from more impactful extractive resources such as ores and fossil fuels. However, many of the extractive concessions awarded to lithium companies overlap with ancestral indigenous territories, communal lands, and protected ecological areas. The extraction of lithium in these areas has also been associated with multiple ecological risks that involve waste generation, landscape change, contamination of surface salts and water bodies, and impacts on flora and fauna. Lithium extraction from mineral and brine deposits has been shown to deplete local water sources. In Chile, lithium is extracted from underground brine found in the Atacama Salt Flat, one of the driest places on Earth. Lithium mining in the Atacama Desert impacts biodiversity, depletes water, and displaces indigenous communities in the extraction areas. Communities that have been marginalized and criminalized by the government for no reason other than that their occupation of this resource-rich land. Chile has been one of the most significant reservoirs of lithium in the world, and due to the characteristics of the reserves, lithium is relatively cheap to demand. However, in contrast to what occurs with oil and coal, a small number of countries have the largest reserves and production of lithium, and these countries are concentrated in the southern hemisphere. In the Atacama Desert, lithium is obtained from salty water drawn from the depths of the land, then extracted using a chemical process. For the first step, companies drain more than 63 billion liters of salty water per year. For the second part of the process, companies use and contaminate fresh water. Although mining companies argue that the water pumped from the underground of the desert is not used for human consumption, a rich variety of microorganisms that grow where nourish local species. Furthermore, the amount of water extracted from the Atacama Desert exceeded what the groundwater can generate sustainably. A single electric vehicle battery requires 63 kilograms of lithium carbonate. Each ton of lithium carbonate, or the equivalent for 14 electric vehicles, requires the evaporation of 2 million liters of water, the equivalent of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The central impact of lithium extraction in Chile relates to water use because the process involves the extraction of significant volumes of water from below the salt flats that cannot be sustainably replenished at the same rate that the water is pumped out. Brine extraction from the underground of the salt flats reduces the availability of fresh water in other areas of the salt plain for plants, animals, and human consumption. Due to the lack of water, indigenous communities who inhabit the area have had to reduce their agricultural and pastoral activities, growing corn, quinoa, and potatoes, and raising small-scale Andean livestock like guancos, llamas, and alpacas, while new generations have chosen to work in the mines or migrate to cities to obtain a livelihood. Moreover, the increasing evaporation in the area and the higher land and lagoon temperatures have provoked local climate change that has directly affected the fragile biodiversity around the salt flats, reducing animal populations and plant survival. The pressure to extract lithium from the salt flats will continue if rudimentary evaporation technology remains one of the cheapest technologies. The populations of the Atacama Salt Flat are in areas distant from those most important urban centers, and they constitute mostly small towns, communities, or ayulas of mostly 50 to 500 inhabitants, except along strategic commercial routes. This region has been home to human settlements for millennia, including for the Lichen Ente, the Atacamameños people, Kola, Quicha, and Aymara peoples. These communities have traditionally relied on agriculture, livestock rearing, and small-scale commerce. The presence of mining companies further impacts these local communities. These impacts include the loss of their livelihoods, the extinction of plants for medicinal use, and internal conflicts regarding how to spend the royalties that the communities receive from the mining companies. Additional problems include theft, drug addiction, and alcoholism among community members. Mining tempts young members to work in the mines for a salary and to abandon their farming traditions or to migrate to the cities for better opportunities. Mining companies also affect the local economy by providing jobs to people from other regions. Lithium consumption is expected to significantly increase in the years ahead, motivated by green electromobility policies and everything related to the storage of renewable energy needed for decarbonization. This increase in demand will have extreme repercussions in the extractive zones, such as in Chile, where the mining companies request increases in the daily limits of brine extraction. The same happens in Argentina and Bolivia because the three countries are located in the quote-unquote lithium triangle. Demand may also call for the appearance of new lithium extractive projects such as in Nevada, the United States, or Mexico. As long as the colonialist policies of resource extraction stay in place, countries in the global south that pollute the least and do not have electric vehicles will suffer the most. With an increase in lithium demand, the negative impacts of lithium consumption will worsen. Their lands are destroyed and their water is contaminated. It is essential to learn the lesson from all the colonialist mining projects that have taken place in non-industrial countries to work for policies that promote solid local policies to protect their land. There is a need to rethink solutions that move us away from fossil fuels and address climate change. Radical approaches are required, including drastically divesting from capitalist, colonialist life, changing the mobility matrix away from single-occupant vehicles, and challenging the paradigm of progress requires real transformation, not a mere shifting in focus within the colonialist extractive model. Also, just to sum up, one of the kind of points that Archibald was bringing up is that trying to just create a one-on-one replacement to the very, consumption-based model of capitalist civilization, but just, instead of doing it with fossil fuels, do it with, solar power, blah, 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 stuff, that kind of stuff. That's not going to do all that much, and it's going to create keep a lot of the same problems that we have around. To really create a more sustainable world, that means we all have to live a little bit more sustainably. And that is, unfortunately, that's a harsh reality that a lot of even kind of liberal climate activists don't want to bring up. You can't have your American cheeseburger and eat it too, as it were. Again, if we're looking to just replace all of our consumption habits by using lithium-based batteries, we're going to be continuing to do a lot of the resource extraction and colonial injustice that was perpetrated by the fossil fuels that came before it. So that's really something that we need to think about when we want to put the just in just transition. Well, folks, I think I'm going to wrap up my segment here. I want to thank y'all for tuning in. This has been Media Cyphers, only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. I want to remind y'all, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, and check out our Media Cyphers podcast. You can stream that on most podcasting apps.